So the European Union just announced that they're planning to develop decryption capabilities for private data by 2030. They published their roadmap on June 24th, and if you're a regular viewer of this channel, you already know where this is actually headed, straight to digital totalitarianism. They call it the Protect EU strategy, and even the stupid name that they give it is propaganda, just how it sounds. It's that kind of classic government doublespeak where protection actually means surveillance and security actually means control, and where lawful access actually means breaking into your private messages and reading your stuff. Every single word is designed to hide what they're actually building, which is a hellish surveillance state that would make the Stasi jealous. The EU claims that they need lawful and effective access to encrypted data to fight things like terrorism and organized crime, but they won't tell you exactly how they actually plan to do it. And their roadmap promises to present a decryption technology roadmap in 2026, and that will assess technological solutions for lawful access, as they like to call it. This bureaucratic speak, again, we can translate to, we're going to force backdoors into every encryption system that there is. And this is the absolute nightmare that exists for those that are in the EU. And this is based on my research, but they're not actually claiming they can break encryption because that remains still impossible, more or less. Breaking AES 256, for example, would require more computational power than exists on Earth for longer than the universe has existed. It has a key space with 2 to the power of 256 for the number of possible combinations that actually exist. More combinations than atoms in the observable universe. Instead, they're planning something much worse and much easier, which is client-side scanning that reads your messages before they actually get encrypted, and backdoors that actually give them master keys to your data, and legal threats to try to force companies to comply, which we all know they absolutely will. Commissioner Magnus Brunner said we need to, quote, change mindsets and ways of thinking about security, close quote. I'd expect that means dumping all personal emails into the public space, getting rid of curtains, and disclosing all private data. They won't actually do any of that, but will expect everyone else to be okay to do that electronically with this. Like when politicians talk about changing mindsets, they mean breaking your resistance to surveillance. They want you to believe that giving up things like privacy makes you safer, like sheep believing that the wolf protects them from other predators, right? Like their high-level group report from March of 2025 contains 42 recommendations for just privacy, totally. At least they're, being specific about how they'll actually violate your rights. I kind of have to give them that. I also have to say that at least they're a little bit more upfront about it than our own NSA actually is and has been for years. Looking at their exact timeline shows how they're building this kind of digital prison out, which is really the best name for it at the end of the day. In 2026, they present their decryption technology roadmap, which again is not actual decryption, but expect demands for backdoors and Chiestro. 2027 is the cross-border surveillance sharing between EU, which is supposed to go live then. 2028 is when AI tools get deployed that actually automatically process and analyze the seized data. And they're also dumping money into quantum cryptography research at Europol, preparing for future surveillance capabilities. And I'm sure that will absolutely go great, and nothing bad will ever happen from any of those things being done. The metadata retention framework, which is scheduled for 2025 and 2026, creates another surveillance layer that'll exist. And they'll know who you are, who you're communicating with, when you're communicating with them, where you are, and for how long you are there. Combined with their decryption plans, they'll have a complete map of your digital life. And the Stasi employed 1/3 of citizens to spy on the other 2/3. This is much more efficient than that. The Soviet Union read every letter, monitored every call, and disappeared anyone who spoke against the state. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI kept secret files on millions of Americans, including Martin Luther King, John Lennon, and anyone who threatened their power structure at the time. But none of that is even remotely close to how bad this system will be in comparison. And it'll never end. COINTELPRO actively destroyed lives. They forged letters, they broke up marriages, they planted evidence to try to frame activists, and assassinated Fred Hampton while he slept. The NSA's PRISM program went by the same kind of hellish playbook, just with better technology. Edward Snowden, for example, gave us a kind of glimpse into this and showed us that they collect everything, your emails, your texts, your photos, your location. Every authoritarian system starts with protecting citizens and ends with just absolutely crushing them. Their justifications are really just pathetic propaganda. The EU's own data shows that in 2023, 90% of over-the-top communications were encrypted, and 97% of mobile messages used encryption apps. They cite cases like the 2017 Westminster Bridge attack, where encryption, quote, hindered investigators. Well, can't have those investigators hindered. You know what else hinders investigations? Well, pesky things like due process, or privacy rights, or the presumption of innocence. So because it inconveniences public servants, known as police, should we eliminate those too? It just makes no sense. The Europol's decryption platform already supported 37 investigations in 2023 that we know of, including operations that we've talked about before on this channel, like SkyECC and EncroChat. They have capabilities, but it's never enough for these people, right? They're worse than crackheads, really. They're transforming Europol into Europe's FBI, but worse, they're giving it powers for cross borders and complex cases with zero accountability. Imagine America's federal agents, but with jurisdiction from Portugal to Poland. And Robin Wilton from the Internet Society warned the plan jeopardizes the security and privacy of millions. The Global Encryption Coalition, which is 89 organizations strong, sent a letter on May 26th explaining that their plans would create vulnerabilities that were exploitable by criminals and hostile state actors. They pointed out that the past EU efforts focused on client-side scanning, which violated the promise of end-to-end encryption. Security experts unanimously agree that you can't create lawful access without creating vulnerabilities for every single person who uses these devices. Every backdoor built for law enforcement becomes an entry point for criminals, for foreign intelligence services, and for just hackers in general. It's kind of putting a master key under your doormat and hoping that only the police find it and use it. The political abuse has already started. If we look at Hungary under Viktor Orban, they use surveillance tools to track dissidents, track oppositional politicians, maintain power through fear. Now, multiply that across 27 EU countries. Far-right parties getting access to immigration communications, far-left governments targeting business owners. The infrastructure for tyranny gets built by moderates claiming to fight terrorism, then inherited by extremists who use it exactly as designed. Social media shows people understand what's actually happening, even if the mainstream media, which, as per the norm, refuses to cover it. A Reddit thread, for example, from July actually exploded with 2,500 votes and 224 comments comparing this to the great Chinese Firewall and East German Stasi, which is actually where I stole the comparison from earlier. User Anico 7 asked in check why anyone still supports the EU given its brutal restrictions on freedom, privacy, and wealth. And Decrypt Media exposed how they're also banning anonymous crypto wallets and privacy coins by July of 2027. Complete financial surveillance paired with communication surveillance. Criminals will just switch to open source encryption tools. That's how that'll go. They'll download Signal or forks from GitHub, compile them on their own, and use protocols that route around that surveillance. Meanwhile, your grandmother's medical bills and conversations actually become accessible to all these bureaucrats and all these threat actors. Your daughter's private messages get stored in government databases. Your business negotiations sit waiting for the next data breach to happen. And it will. Law-abiding citizens lose all privacy while actual criminals laugh at the surveillance theater. The economic devastation will probably be immediate with this too. Weakening encryption absolutely destroys online banking security. E-commerce becomes vulnerable to fraud. Every backdoor that they try to, mandate becomes a target for a Chinese intelligence officer or Russian hackers and organized crime in general. They're creating the exact vulnerabilities that they claim to be trying to prevent and funding the organizations that they're virtue signaling that they hate. And they can't stand that you might actually have a private conversation. Now, I might be wrong about that. Like it's, like the tax-free banking district in London or whatever, typically the masters, the rulers, only apply the rules to the serfs. The propaganda campaign frames anyone opposing this as a supporter of terrorism and child abuse, which is classic authoritarianism. It's just pure manipulation. They ignore that journalists need encryption to protect sources from retaliation, that human rights, just a privacy. How about that? Like activists needed also to organize against oppressive regimes. Abuse victims needed to escape their abusers. Businesses needed to protect trade secrets worth billions in some cases. But according to Brussels, none of that matters compared to the make-believe boogeyman and their surveillance demands. They'll target companies with massive fines and criminal prosecutions, even though there's no victims. Comply or be destroyed. And we saw this with the lava bit in the US when they shut down rather than compromise on user privacy, which was one of the most based things I'd seen in a while when that happened. Apple removed end-to-end encryption from British iCloud users after government threats. The EU will be even more aggressive. And this isn't just like Europe's problem, right? The US pushes the Earn It Act, attacking encryption through Section 230. Five Eyes nations coordinate their assault on privacy. Like, I said, in the UK, they already forced Apple to remove encryption features. Your encrypted messages basically threaten their global surveillance network, so encryption must be made useless everywhere. The 2026 technology roadmap will reveal their specific kind of demands and tactics. Expect mandatory key escrow, where government can hold copies of all encryption keys, state-controlled certificate authorities, requirements for client-side scanning in all messaging apps, hardware-level surveillance capabilities, the technical architecture of tyranny, basically, all wrapped in talk of lawful access and protecting the children and all that kind of nonsense that we always get. Citizens are already preparing, though, from some of the things I've seen. Forums discuss doing things like using Tails and Unix operating systems. People stack privacy tools, Signal, inside VPNs, inside Tor. They're moving to Monero because it's actually private, unlike the surveilled Bitcoin. Every authoritarian overreach creates equal and opposite reactions in privacy innovation. None of this seems as though it's gonna really end well, though. Like, they're enhancing Europol's digital forensics capabilities starting in 2026. The metadata retention framework that we talked about earlier begins assessment in 2025. Cross-border surveillance cooperation starts in 2027. Every piece builds towards total surveillance by 2030. But implementation begins now. Make no mistake about that. Budget allocations expose their actual priorities. Billions for surveillance technology, while hospitals beg for basic equipment. Unlimited funds for digital forensics and AI tools, but suddenly they're broke when schools need funding. The U.S. spends $80 billion annually on intelligence agencies, while claiming healthcare is just completely unaffordable. Their AI deployment by 2028 industrializes these privacy violations. Machine learning algorithms will process massive volumes of seized data, flag suspicious patterns, identify targets autonomously and automatically. And, it sucks to be you if, you get flagged by accident, like pre-crime detection without the psychics, basically. They're building the infrastructure for algorithmic authoritarianism. The certification schemes for digital forensic experts by 2026 create state-licensed privacy violators. Only government-approved technicians can legally work with encryption data. They're monopolizing the knowledge needed to try and protect yourself, creating a surveillance priesthood. Open-source encryption faces an existing threat. OpenSSL, for example, has over 1,000 contributors worldwide. You can't arrest a mathematical algorithm or fine a decentralized protocol. So they'll use legal pressure on companies, threatening executives with prison if they don't comply with backdoor demands. Even EU citizens need to understand that they're coming. Like your private medical discussions, your business communications, your personal relationships all become potentially accessible to law enforcement. Your entire digital life is subject to surveillance. And once this infrastructure actually exists, it'll never go away. They don't relent on privacy violations. Once they establish something like this, they don't willingly let go of that power. Future governments inherit these capabilities regardless of who builds them, and they build on top of that. They compound it. They make it worse. The EU reveals its authoritarian core through these actions. So behind all this democracy rhetoric and human rights treaties, lies, basically, you have raw power-seeking, total control with some of the worst people that you really want to give that control to. It's also not just the EU, but it seems like nowadays it's every single country that's having these issues all at the same time, separated. It's absolutely insane. In any case, stay safe. As always, I'll see you in the next video.